What's up, YouTubers? I want to make a video on things to consider when expating and kind of the different kind of expating strategies you can use to survive and prosper like outside your country of birth. And depending on what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve, you can have different strategies, not just two, but different criteria to use to judge where you want to go and where you want to settle. Just for example, there's a lot of travelers and a lot of travelers videos that I follow talking about slow travel around the world, spending like a month or 2 or 3 months or 6 months in a country and then going to another country and repeating it and just not settling in one area. That's the kind of strategy that's a little bit different, and you may not really need to think it out too much and do a lot of planning, as opposed to, say you want a second passport or residency, or say you want to integrate yourself into a society and learn another language, do business, work a local job, or live the rest of your life in another country. Things like that. That's totally different than slow traveling the world. And so the criteria you'd use to decide where you want to go or what's the good place or what's the bad place can be totally different. Another idea or thought is, say you think the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and you think this is going to happen in a first world country, or you think there's going to be hyperinflation in your country. Your strategy would be different, and here's how I'd explain it. If you're in a first world country that's very well developed and you quite literally believe there's going to be a police state or there's going to be hyperinflation and things like that, you want to go to a country where there's a low division of labor as opposed to a high division of labor. What I mean by that is, if you're in a first world country like the United States or Canada or Western Europe, with a high division of labor, you make more money doing more complicated things, whereas, or more things that require an education or more specialized labor. Whereas if you live in a first world country and you don't have much education and you're just scrapping by on a piece of land and growing your fruits and vegetables and thriving that way, that would be an example of a low division economy. Why that's important is if you literally believe there's going to be like hyperinflation, or if you believe there's going to be like a police state, then you want to live in a low division of labor economy. And I'll explain why. Because when societies break down, like you could look at modern day Turkey, which is kind of a mix, or Lebanon, which is kind of a mix in that regard. If you're in a big city when hyperinflation is going off, or a war for that matter, or there's a big crackdown on freedom and liberty, the cities usually, well, I don't want to say 80%, but the cities usually have a lot of poverty unless you're in the upper classes, because food won't be sent into towns. I got to get a drink. So, if you believe, like in the United States, if there's ever hyperinflation, or if there's ever a situation where the trucking's going to stop, food's not going to be delivered, then you better be stocked up on food. Or if you're looking to immigrate, you better live in a society where the division of labor is not that high. A good example would be like in Central America or Southern Mexico, or Mexico would be a combination of both, but where there's a lot of people living off the land and there's people selling food in the market. And even if there's a hyperinflation, you can always trade for what you want to get. Whereas if you're in a first world country, you don't have trade goods, or you haven't stocked up on food, and the ATM machines aren't giving out cash, you're shit out of luck. This is what I mean. So if you're looking, so if what you're hedging against or what you think is wrong with where you live at now and you want to immigrate, and you're not a slow traveler, but you're looking for like a long-term place, you want to live in that place, and you want to either get a job run a business, or all those things. You need to think through where you want to live, because like if you think there's going to be inflation, you want to live in a country where if the division of labor breaks down, you can just go into a market like a central market, like here in Central America, and you can just trade for it if you want for food, or you can, things still work and there's not hyperinflation. Just take money out of a cash machine and pay for what you want. Now, when you're thinking about all this, you need to think about, can you get a residency if that's what you're looking for? Or here's how I think about it. Like, can you get a residency if that's what you want? And if I have to work in the local economy, how much money will I make? Well, if you determine you're not going to make that much money, maybe that's not a good place for you. So maybe parts of Central America wouldn't work for you, whereas in parts of Brazil it would, and in parts of Argentina, because they still have a pretty developed economy in Argentina. And Brazil, for example, actually, I'm starting to meet more and more people from Brazil and Argentina. But if you do have specialized skills, you can actually make $15 to $20 an hour in those kinds of places, or the equivalent in their currency. I'll put it that way. Another thing is, let's say you don't have specialized skills and you just want to earn kind of the minimum wage or whatever the minimum wages are from a free market point of view, not what the law says, but what the wages actually are. A place like Brazil can be nice because you can earn enough money to pay for like a room or a small apartment and get by pretty good. Maybe not in the two big cities there, but kind of in the smaller cities or in more in the hinterlands. So if you look at it from a culture point of view from Brazil, there's a lot of immigration. There's lots of people from all over the world, and there's all different races of people living and working in the markets, in small businesses. So you won't feel out of place. You won't feel uncomfortable. And in that regard, Brazil can be quite a bit like the United States. But the problem with Brazil is they do, from time to time, have mild exchange controls. I'm not sure if it's easy to open a dollar account in Brazil. I bring that up because if you're worried about hyperinflation, or you're worried about exchange controls, and you're not going to bug out, and you don't have money offshore, what are you going to do to protect your savings? The reason I mentioned Brazil is you can either buy a house already built and do that with a mortgage against it. That's another thing, because it's kind of an economy in the middle. It's a place where you can actually get a mortgage fairly easy compared to, like, say, Central America. Now, I say fairly easy. It depends if you have all the paperwork. If you do not have the paperwork, you can always buy a piece of land and build on it. That's kind of what I mean. But if you're going to stay there a long time, and if you're worried about like a inflationary collapse, you want to have a way to protect your savings. If you have savings in the bank and you can't access dollars, or they put exchange controls on and you can't put your money offshore. So that's why I mentioned all this, because if that's what your concern is, then you want to live in a country where either gold and silver coins are available in the market, and there's a liquid enough coins or liquidity in the market. Like, say, if you have $50,000, you can buy $50,000 worth of gold coins. The trouble with a lot of Latin American countries, they don't have liquid gold markets to just go out and buy gold coins that are low premium coins. So a way you can work around that and protect your savings is do what Mexicans do and other Latin Americans do. A lot of times what they'll do is, if they think that the currency of their country is going to devalue, and if they can't put it offshore, if they can't buy local dollars, or they can't buy gold coins or silver coins, they buy a lot of cement, and then they store it in a storage site, a place where they have storage and other building materials. And or like if you're in Guatemala, you can buy a lot of granite and I forget the other one. That really expensive stone that they have in Brazil. So stuff like that gets exported up to here. You can buy it, and every year it goes up in price. It's kind of like hard lumbers. So stuff like that you can buy and just store it in a storage facility, or your own storage facility. I say that because quite a few Mexicans I know have done that in the past, and quite a few gringos have done that. Like, for example, one gringo I know, he couldn't easily buy gold, and he wanted gold So he came from Brazil. He came from Belize into Central America, and he bought a lot of gold jewelry. And for under the spot price, he just would go around making offers to not coin shops, places that sell jewelry, like pawn shops, things of that nature. He put the message out that he was looking for gold, and that's what he did. And then he bought all this gold with the idea, like, if he wanted to, because he's in Belize, he could either ship it up, take it up physically up to the United States. There's two refiners you can melt down. One refiner, you have to have a larger amount. The other refiner, it's, I think, less than an ounce of gold. And you send it, they refine it down, they send you a check. Now, if you're a privacy seeker, you can have a lawyer, an accountant, or your family member do that and get the check, and then cash a check and give you the money, just as an aside. No, that strategy wouldn't work if you're in South America, and I don't know the refineries in South America, so I don't know how you would use that strategy. But that's how you use that strategy here. He would buy the gold and refine it down and get the money. Another thing he did was he'd buy it. He bought a piece of land in Central America, not Belize, but in one of the adjoining countries. He buried it in the ground, put concrete on top, and then built a little shed. And then, that's what he did. Then he jetted off to South America. Anyways, so that's this kind of the strategy you can do if those are concerns to you. I bring this up because a lot of people don't think about it, like, if they're not keeping wealth in an offshore bank, or if they're not thinking in those terms, but they plan to have capital in the future, you have to think about how you're going to protect your capital if there's exchange controls and things like that, and hyperinflation or mild inflation. Like in Brazil, they don't have hyperinflation, but mild. So can you have access? So if you live there and you have a job, can you get credit? That's another thing. It's hard to get credit in places like Mexico and Central America, whereas it's easier to get credit in places like Brazil and Argentina. Well, somewhat. So, like, if you can get credit, and you can get credit to buy a home, that's a good hedge against inflation long term. And in Latin America, people especially put money in houses as an inflation hedge. That would be the main thing. Like in your offshore destination that you're going to, will you have the ability and enough income coming in, and can you meet the minimum requirements to buy a home on credit? Brazil, that's much easier to do than other parts of Latin America. Like, say, in the Philippines or in Guatemala, that's much, much more difficult. Or what you can do is what other Latin Americans do. If you don't have access to credit, you can buy a piece of land and build on it little by little. And then as inflation erodes the local currency, you can eventually, when you retire, if you have two homes, sell one, live in the other, have local currency for the rest of your life. You can deposit in the bank or whatever, earn interest, or you can have, like, live in one house and rent out the other one and live off that income for the rest of your life, or things like that. That's why I like to have people think about, like, what are your concerns? Like, what are you hedging against when you leave the country? If you're not hedging against anything, you're not worried about anything, then everything I just said does not really matter. But if you're worried about, like how you're going to earn a living and you're going to actually physically work in the local economy, then you might want to pick a country like Argentina or Brazil, where you can earn much, much higher wages compared to Central America. And it's not weird as a foreigner coming in from Europe, the US, Africa, Asia. There's people from all over the world coming into Brazil, all working kind of at very similar jobs. And these jobs pay enough to live on. As an aside, I know quite a few people in Brazil making $15 to $20 an hour. And when I mean by that, I mean working at like a office, like on a construction site. I don't mean they're making $15 an hour at a construction site, but I mean they're doing physical jobs, going to places. They're not working online. That's what I mean. And also, I mean, there's entry-level jobs where you don't have to have a lot of skills. They're not easy to get, but you can get them if you get work permits and residency and all that. That's what I mean. And if you're very skilled, you have soft skills and people skills, you can work your way up in companies, and then get enough to earn enough money to buy a home, or to get a bank loan to buy a home, or however they do it there. So you have to ask yourself, what do you want? Like if you're a retiree or if you're an investor and you're living off your capital, it's not as important to decide where you're going to live. And then if you're not worried about inflation or government overreach or government um, intrusions into your life, then it doesn't matter as much. But if you are, you can pick like a country where, like, say Mexico or Brazil. These are very similar in that, like if there's ever a clampdown in big cities, you can just move to a smaller town or a smaller community or a smaller city where a lot of these things won't be enforced, or culturally they won't be enforced because there's a different culture in southern Mexico as compared to northern Mexico. The same would be said like in southern Brazil to northern Brazil. And then there's also too, once you get into the hinterlands of the Amazon or the jungle, or those things really, really break down. So, and that's just like another thing, like I'm hesitant to say this, but in some of these countries, it may not be legal for you to mine for gold, as an example, like artisanal mining. I'm talking about like Costa Rica. My understanding is it's illegal for foreigners to do that. Now, maybe as a legal resident of Brazil, that's legal. I'm not really sure, but I wonder. But see, like in some of those cultures, like in South America and certain parts of, just in certain parts of Latin America, I've actually known foreigners who mine artisanal gold. Now, when they did it in the Dominican Republic, that was legal and they got the permits. In Honduras, another place I know of, I think it was the same. I mention it because people do these things to get by and make pretty good money, and gold is at a high price now. And you have foreigners, like foreign Chinese or foreign people coming in and buying up what you got. Now, if you can do that in a discreet way and get away with it, that's one thing. But if you can't, you can't. Anyways, to add on to that, what I see a lot of people do is they'll take their skills that they have in the U.S. and they'll transfer them like to a place like Brazil or Mexico, or for that matter. Like they may buy a house or a cheap house and fix it up and then flip it. But then again, that's assuming you have the capital. Or if there's a system in the country they go to where they can get access to easy credit, not necessarily cheap credit, but easy credit, then they find a place they fix up, they buy it on credit, assuming they have enough money coming in. And then they fix it up and flip it. Or what I've seen people do, and like I know people have done this in Argentina, but also to Europe. That's why I say it depends on the economy you're in. Like you could do this in Argentina, parts of Europe, but some of this you might not. Well, actually, you can do it even here. There's a Japanese guy, Taka House. He rents out rooms. So like what some foreigners do, they'll buy or rent a place and then rent out rooms. There's locals that do this. I know a lady who used to do that here. And then there's the infamous Taka House. He's Japanese. He rents out to Japanese and Koreans. So at some, like this one woman I used to know in Argentina, she would rent a house and then rent out rooms, and how she paid for her living. So you want to find countries where that's acceptable culturally and it's legal and whatnot. I knew this English woman in Baltimore. She did the same thing, but she didn't live there legally, but she owned a home. So like it's in the United States, for those that don't know, you can come in on a tourist visa, buy a house on contract for deed pretty easily, and then rent out rooms and live there. Now you're supposed to get residency. Now I heard after 9/11 they started cracking down on that. So you'd want to come in. So yeah, as an investor, you'd come in legally and do all that right away. Then what I guess some of these people do is they just overstay and they never leave. This English lady I knew, that's what she did. And I know a Norwegian doing that in Seattle and in Florida. Anyways, a lot of those strategies used in the U.S., you can transfer those strategies into a place like Argentina or Brazil. And then there's some countries where that kind of strategy is much harder because it's not easy to buy houses on contract for deed. Although I know of one person in Central America here in Guatemala who's done that. But the terms are quite a bit different than what you would do in the States. So when you're thinking of expating, you have to think what you're trying to accomplish, what your fears are, or what you're trying to avoid. A lot of gringos, when they leave, they want a low tax place. They're looking to avoid tax. They're looking for a place to avoid a lot of regulations, legally, of course. So you have to factor all that in and then go where your skills are best or go where your skills are valued more. Now, That's why I keep coming back. I mentioned southern Brazil, where those skills can be employed. But it's not just Brazil. There's quite a few countries like in Brazil where like you can run a stall and sell stuff out of a stall. Now you can do that in other parts of Latin America, but again, because it's a land of immigrants, it's culturally more normal. So you would have a pretty good chance of surviving and doing something like that. Again, if you had the skills from doing it in another country. If you had no skills doing that, it might not work. Okay, let me see. I mean, that's really basically what I wanted to cover in this video is like, what are you trying to, well, here's a story. There's a story of, there's a famous economist, I can't think of his name, but he was in Germany during the war, and he cannot get a visa out of Germany, and he knew the cities were going to get bombed by the Americans. So what he did was he moved out. He was a professor. He moved out of a city and moved into the country, and that's how he avoided getting killed during the war. And then he had a house in Germany with a mortgage on it, growing, farming. So how he survived was the mortgage was basically an asset. In other words, the hyperinflation wiped out the value of the mortgage. He sold his agricultural stuff, and that's how he made the money and was able to later come to the States because of that piece of land. So that the moral of the story is, if you think there's going to be inflation or mass inflation, and you don't want to be in a big city when there's a crisis, you need to think and plan on having a house or a country house, and if you can get a mortgage on it, and then whatever you need to do to pay the bills while you're doing all that. Now, this is like a long time ago, so farming was a thing back then. Nowadays, you would just grow specialized fruits and herbs and spices, things like that, and then sell them into the market. Now, I used to know a guy in the Philippines. He rented a plot, maybe a 1/4 acre plot, I think, something like that, maybe a 1/2 acre. And anyone who's been in the Philippines can relate to the fact that a lot of the markets, the vegetables there aren't exactly fresh or edible. That's kind of a controversial thing to say, but it's a little bit different from other parts of the world. So he specialized in spices and vegetables, and he sold them to all the restaurants, a lot of the specialty restaurants, and he made a couple $1,000s. I mean, he didn't start out making a couple $1,000s. If I remember right, he started out making 300, 400, 500. Then he kept honing the market, figuring out where the market was for him, and growing his chain of restaurants he sold to, because he specialized by selling to restaurants. I mean, people do that here in Guatemala all the time. I mean, foreigners. The Mennonites are a really good example. They have their bakeries, they have the restaurants they sell into, they have cafes, restaurants, things like that they sell into, not just their store where they sell out of. So, but anyways, this guy in the Philippines that I used to know, that's what he used to do. So he lived pretty frugally, and he saved him, I don't know, $1,000 a month or whatever. This is a long time ago. But so you have to think about, can you do what you want to do legally? Will it be accepted by other people in the community that you're competing in that way? Because not all countries will accept that, a foreigner coming in and competing with them. So you have to think about that. That's why I come back to some of these countries like Brazil and Argentina. Argentina has its own set of problems. I understand that. It's just an example only. Whereas Argentina, you'd want to have more computer skills. And if you want to live in the country, that'd be fine too. But it's been like since the year 2000, Argentina has never gotten its act in order as far as inflation goes. But anyhow, those are things you want to think about if you're going to live in one place a long time. Can you get a residency? Can you earn money the way you want to earn it, enjoy earning it? Can you use the skills that you already have in the States and transfer them to this other country? If you can't do those things, can you do stuff online until you figure something else out? Can you get paid online with your bank accounts in your old country? Or can you open up accounts in new countries and do it that way? It's not always possible to do both. But if you can, as a hedge, have both just in case. A lot of Americans give up their credit. I know quite a few Americans who give up their credit when they leave. And then 5 or 6 years later they come back to the States and their credit shit because they didn't keep their credit score up. And credit's really, really important. Like if you have a good idea and you have a line of credit in US dollars, you might think 20% interest rate's not low, but in a lot of countries, the interest rate's going to be much higher than 20%. And if you can borrow in dollars, which is a stable currency, and you have a good idea and you can allocate that capital in a way where you can make much more than your 20%, and you can start your business. And I'm talking about doing something productive. I'm not talking about using the credit cards to pay your expenses, although some foreigners have done that. But you can use it to fund your business, get it going, and pay back your loans, and you have that open credit to use to fund other things later on. And that's another thing. More and more countries are making it easier for expats to become residents and get credit. So again, that's another reason why I mentioned places like Brazil. But Brazil's by no means the only place you can do that. More and more countries, like you might not want to get credit in Central America where I'm at, but in other countries, it may be worth it to eventually be able to buy a home. In fact, there's a few ways around that too, which I won't talk about here because it's a little bit controversial, but there are ways you can. People will tell you can't buy a contract for deed, but I know people have done it in both the Philippines and Guatemala. I mean, people I personally know, but it's not easy, but you can do it. But there are other workarounds, but you have to use a lawyer. That's why I don't want to get into it here. If you don't want to use a lawyer, this might not work for you, but if you're willing to have money and employ a lawyer, there's always a workaround. But countries that are getting more and more developed that have credit facilities you can avail yourself to, you can use inflation to your advantage. That's all I bring that up. And then as you accumulate more capital in your new country, you can allocate that to real estate and other things. And then by the time you've been in country 20, 30 years, you can have a house or two and sell one to pay your expenses for the rest of your life, or rent one out or rent the rooms out and collect the rents and meet your daily expenses that way. Anyways, this video's gone on for about 30 minutes. Just some thoughts on things to consider for your expat plan, because a lot of people don't give it a lot of thought. And that's part of the reason they sometimes fail when they leave, because they don't plan out how they can do what they want to do, and also factoring what their concerns are for why they left their first country. If you don't work that out in advance, you can have a much, much tougher time finding a place that works for you. And that's it for tonight. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thanks.